Marcus Taylor stood on the cracked sidewalk in front of the faded sign that still read, "Sunset Bites," even though the bright orange letters had lost their shine and some of the bulbs were now dead. And he stared at it as if it were a ghost from another life. A place he once knew as home, but now felt like a stranger's house. And the weak afternoon sun rested on his face as warm air mixed with the smell of oil and dust from the nearby road, pulling old memories from deep inside him, because this diner was not just a building to him. It was his father's dream, his father's pride, and later, it had been his own responsibility before he left town 2 years ago to take care of business problems that never seemed to end. And in that long time away, everything had changed. His life had changed, his face had aged. And apparently his diner had also been taken away from him in spirit, because no one inside even knew his name now. And so he pulled his worn jacket closer around his shoulders, lowered the old cap on his head, and tried to blend in like any other tired stranger stopping for a cheap bite, knowing well that he looked nothing like the confident owner who once walked through those doors with his head high. As a flicker of doubt passed through his mind, making him wonder if he even belonged there anymore, but still he pushed the glass door open, and the small bell on top rang with a weak sound that felt like it barely remembered how to announce a guest. And as he stepped inside, the soft music in the diner met his ears. A slow song that once played every morning when his father prepared the first pot of coffee, and the familiar scent of toast and eggs drifted through the air, wrapping around him in a strange mix of comfort and pain, because it reminded him of better days when laughter filled the place and workers moved with joy instead of fear. And he noticed a few customers sitting at tables, their faces tired, their movements quiet, their eyes empty as if the diner had lost its soul. And he walked slowly to the counter and sat down, the old stool creaking under his weight. And for a moment, he remembered the younger version of himself sitting at the same spot while his father joked with customers and told stories about life and hard work. But that memory faded when he saw that the walls had been repainted in a dull, careless color. The menu board was different. Cheaper items were added, corners of the ceiling were cracked, and the warm picture of his father that once hung proudly behind the counter had disappeared, replaced by a plain sign that said, "No credit." No complaints, and his heart felt heavier as he realized someone had not only taken control of his diner, but had also erased the memory of the man who built it. And as he sat there thinking, a young waitress walked up to him, her steps quiet, her eyes tired but kind, and she gave him a gentle, almost sad smile. And her name tag read Nina in simple blue letters, and she looked like someone who had too much weight on her shoulders for her age. And in a soft voice she asked, "What can I get you, sir?" And Marcus met her eyes for only a second before looking down at the counter, answering calmly, "Just toast and black coffee." And she nodded without speaking again, turning away and moving toward the small kitchen, and Marcus watched her go, noticing how the kitchen door looked old and dirty, how the sound of angry voices and clattering pans came from inside, and how the air seemed heavy, as if the place was slowly being choked by something dark and hidden. And as he waited, his fingers gently touched the edge of the counter, feeling the scratches of time, remembering the night he had helped his father fix a broken chair right there, remembering the laughter, the smell of fresh bread, the pride in his father's eyes, and a quiet anger started to rise inside him as he wondered who had allowed his diner to fall like this and why no one had protected it. And then Nina returned with a small plate of toast and a chipped cup of black coffee, placing them on the counter in front of him with careful hands. And as she did so, she leaned slightly closer, so that only he could hear, and in a whisper so soft it almost blended with the music, she said, "Don't eat that. Not unless you want to get sick." And the moment those words reached him, his hand froze in the air, fingers hovering just above the warm toast, and his heart suddenly began to beat faster. a sharp cold feeling running through him, because her voice had not sounded like a joke or a warning to hurry. It had sounded serious, scared, and honest. And he looked up quickly, confused, worried, whispering back, "Why?" But she had already stepped away from the counter, as if nothing had happened. Her face turned calm again for the eyes of others, and Marcus stared at the toast in front of him, the edges slightly burnt, a thin layer of butter shining on top, and his mind filled with questions, fear, and confusion, wondering what was wrong with the food, wondering what kind of danger was hidden in this simple plate, and more importantly, wondering why this young woman had chosen to warn a complete stranger. As his eyes slowly followed her moving figure across the diner, noticing the way she avoided looking at the kitchen, noticing the tension in her shoulders, noticing how the manager in the back, a tall, rude-looking man with sharp eyes, watched over the staff like a guard. And Marcus realized then that this was no longer just a broken business. It was a place filled with secrets, lies, and something much darker than he had expected. And as he sat there motionless, staring at the untouched toast, a deep thought echoed in his mind, asking him a single dangerous question. Was she trying to save him? Or was this the beginning of a trap meant to destroy him? And with that heavy thought, part one of his return came to a quiet but powerful end, leaving the air full of suspense, danger, and a whisper that had already started to change everything. Marcus did not touch the toast, and he did not lift the cup either, because something inside him told him that the quiet warning he had just heard was real. And as he sat there, pretending to look calm, his eyes slowly began to study every detail around him again, trying to see what he had missed when he first walked in. And what he saw only made his stomach feel tighter, because the workers in the diner did not move freely. They moved like people on a timer, careful and afraid. And every time the tall man stepped out of the kitchen, their backs grew straight and their hands moved faster, as if even one mistake could bring punishment. And Marcus now understood that this man was the one in control, the one who had turned his father's warm, friendly diner into a cold, silent place. And the more Marcus watched, the more he noticed small, strange things, like how the butter container on the counter was almost empty and watery, how the coffee did not smell fresh like it used to, and how a quiet argument could be heard from the back, broken words of anger and apology mixing together, and yet no one dared step in or complain. And Marcus wondered if the whisper had anything to do with what was happening in the kitchen. And as his thoughts circled, Nina walked past him again, carrying empty plates from another customer, and for just a moment their eyes met. And in that short second, he could see fear in her expression. Real fear, not imagined, and it was clear she had taken a risk by warning him. And that thought made him more curious than ever. So he gently pushed the plate a little away from himself so it looked like he had lost interest in the food. And when the tall man glanced in his direction, Marcus lifted the cup and pretended to take a small sip before putting it down again, acting like an ordinary tired customer who did not care enough to complain. And the man seemed bored and turned away, walking back into the kitchen. And Marcus felt a small relief, but it did not last long, because now he did not just feel like a stranger in his own diner. He felt like a man walking into a hidden storm, and every quiet sound around him felt louder. Every movement felt important. And he started to understand that whatever Nina had tried to tell him, it was only the surface of a bigger problem. And after a few minutes, she returned to the counter again, wiping her hands on a cloth, her face calm for others, but her eyes still holding a warning. And she spoke just loud enough for anyone listening to think it was normal customer service, saying, "Would you like more sugar for your coffee, sir?" While her eyes seemed to beg him to understand, there was something else she wanted to say. And Marcus answered in the same normal tone, "No, thank you, But as she leaned slightly forward to pick up a small spoon, she let her fingers slide. Something tiny across the counter toward him. Something so small and quick that no one would notice. And when he looked down, he saw folded paper. No bigger than a matchstick, and he slowly slid it into his palm, keeping his hand hidden against his leg beneath the counter. And his heart beat faster again as he waited for the right moment to open it. But he knew he could not do it there because the tall man kept stepping out of the kitchen again and again, as if watching for something suspicious. So Marcus stood up slowly, leaving a few coins on the counter, and nodded at Nina as if to thank her for the service. And she gave a quiet nod back, her eyes filled with a strange mix of fear and hope. And Marcus walked toward the back of the diner, as if looking for the restroom. And when he reached a small empty hallway, he carefully opened the folded paper with shaking fingers, and on it, written in rushed, nervous handwriting, were only a few words. But those words were enough to make his blood run cold, because it said, "The food is not safe. He controls everything. If you want the truth, meet me near the back door in 10 minutes. Alone." And Marcus stared at the message again and again as if it might change. But it did not, and suddenly the whisper, the bad toast, the fear, the changed walls, all began to form one dark picture inside his mind. And the thought that someone could use his father's diner for something dangerous made anger slowly rise inside his quiet heart. But at the same time, he knew he had to be smart. Because if the man in the kitchen truly controlled everything, then one wrong move could put Nina in danger, and maybe even himself. And so Marcus folded the paper, placed it in his pocket, and looked around the hallway carefully to make sure he was alone. And when he stepped back out into the diner, he noticed that the tall man was staring at him for a few seconds longer than before, his sharp eyes full of suspicion. And Marcus lowered his head slightly and walked past him without saying a word, stepping outside for a moment to get fresh air. And as the door closed behind him and the bell rang again, he felt the wind touch his face, helping him think clearly, and he looked toward the back of the building from a distance, seeing a narrow path that led to a small hidden door surrounded by old boxes and trash bins. And he realized that was the place she meant. And while the 10 minutes slowly passed, Marcus waited near the edge of the parking lot, his thoughts racing with questions, wondering who Nina really was, wondering why she trusted a stranger with such a secret, wondering if it had anything to do with his father's old workers or the old days of the diner. And when the time finally felt right, he walked carefully toward the back, each step filled with silent tension. And as he reached the hidden door, he saw Nina standing there, her back against the wall, looking around nervously. And when she saw him, her eyes filled with both relief and fear, and before he could even speak, she whispered again, her voice shaking this time, "You should not have come here. If he sees you with me, we are both in trouble." And Marcus looked at her with serious eyes and answered quietly in the same calm tone, "Then tell me what is really happening in my diner." And Nina froze for a moment when she heard those words, because something in the way he said, it made her realize that he was not just a stranger. And in that quiet, tense moment behind the diner, the truth stood right on the edge of coming out, waiting to be spoken. As danger moved closer with every passing second, Nina stared at Marcus for a long, silent moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to see through the cap, the tired clothes and the quiet voice. And the fear in her expression slowly mixed with shock as his words echoed in her mind. Because no stranger would say such a thing unless it was true. And the way he said, "my diner," did not sound like a joke. It sounded like a painful truth. And for a second she almost laughed from the strange tension of it all. But the sound never came, because behind them the kitchen door slammed, and distant footsteps reminded her that time was not on their side. And she whispered, "What did you just say?" And Marcus lifted his head slightly, his eyes now more steady, more serious. And he replied in the same quiet tone, "This place belonged to my father. And then it belonged to me." And Nina's hand flew to her mouth as if to hold back a gasp, her heart suddenly racing. And she shook her head slowly, whispering, "No." The owner disappeared. Carl said he left it behind. And when she said Carl's name, a deep anger flashed in Marcus's eyes. But he kept his voice calm and low. Carl was only a manager. He was never meant to own anything here. And now Nina truly believed him. Not just because of his words, but because of the sadness in his eyes. The way he looked at the building, like someone looking at a lost family member. And she felt something strange inside her, a mix of hope and pain. Because she had heard old stories from the older workers about a kind owner and his hard-working son. And now that son was standing right in front of her. Hidden, broken, but still strong in some way. And she whispered, "I warned you about the food because he is using cheap, bad supplies. Sometimes even expired ones. People have gotten sick, but he pays them to stay quiet." And Marcus clenched his jaw, feeling his hands tighten into fists in his pockets. And she continued, her voice shaking more now. "He also takes money that should go to the staff. He cuts hours. He threatens anyone who talks back. Everyone is scared of him." And Marcus felt each word fall on him like a heavy weight. Because this was not just about ruined business anymore. This was about people's lives being hurt under his roof. And he looked at Nina, seeing how thin she was, how tired her eyes looked. And he asked gently, "Why do you stay here?" And for the first time her face softened and a quiet sadness touched her lips. And she said, "My mother used to work here when your father owned it. She loved this diner. She said it was the only place that ever felt like family." And Marcus's heart ached at those words, because he remembered his father often praising a kind, hard-working woman who always smiled while cleaning the tables. And he said softly, "I remember her." And when Nina heard that, her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, not wanting to appear weak. And in that short moment, something warm passed between them. A soft connection that neither of them could fully explain. And in the middle of all the fear, something gentle began to grow. Something like trust. Something like the first small spark of love. And Marcus realized that Nina was not just a brave waitress. She was someone tied to the heart of this place, just like he was. And as they stood there, close together in the quiet space behind the diner, he said, "I'm going to fix this, but I can't do it alone." And she looked up at him, surprised, worried, yet somehow hopeful, and she asked, "What are you going to do?" And Marcus looked back at the building, at the dirty walls and broken doors, and then back at her, and answered in a calm but determined voice, "I'm going to expose Carl and take back what he stole. And I'm going to make this diner safe again." And those words made her heart pound, because they were dangerous, but also powerful. And for the first time since she started working there, she felt like someone was finally standing up for what was right. And even though fear still lived in her chest, a small, brave part of her whispered that she wanted to help this man, the true owner, the man who carried the memory of something better. And in that quiet promise between them, hidden from the world, their risky plan began to form. While inside the diner, Carl's shadow still moved, unaware that the first step toward his fall had already been taken. Marcus and Nina did not stay behind the diner for long, because every second they stood there felt like a danger waiting to be seen. So after he told her his plan to expose Carl and take back the diner, they both slowly stepped away from the back door as if nothing happened. And Marcus walked around the side of the building while Nina returned inside through the staff entrance. Her heart still beating fast, her mind filled with fear but also with something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. And when Marcus came back in through the front a few minutes later, he acted like a normal customer again, keeping his head low and moving quietly to a small corner table instead of the counter. And from there, he watched everything more closely than before, because now every small detail mattered. And he saw how Carl shouted orders, how he pushed workers around with words, how he laughed when food fell and was still used, how he kept a tight eye on the cash register. And Marcus understood that this man believed he owned everything, every wall, every plate, every person. And that made Marcus even more determined to stop him. And later that day, when the diner grew quieter and most customers had left, Nina walked past Marcus's table with a tray. And without looking at him, she whispered just enough for him to hear, "He keeps the bad supplies in the left freezer." And then she walked away as if she had said nothing at all. And Marcus felt a cold anger rush through him, because that freezer once held the best ingredients his father had carefully chosen every morning, and now it held danger. And as the evening went on, Marcus pretended to be busy on his phone, but in reality, he used it to secretly record short videos of the dirty counters, the broken fridge, the flies near the sink, and even Carl yelling at a young worker for dropping a spoon. And each time he pressed the record button, he felt like he was collecting pieces of the truth, pieces that could not be hidden forever. And when Carl walked close to his table and asked in a rough voice, "You still here?" Marcus simply nodded and said, "Waiting for a friend." And Carl glanced at him with suspicion for a moment before walking away. And as night began to fall and the sky outside turned dark blue, Marcus received another quiet message, this time on his phone from an unknown number that only said, "Be careful tonight." And even though he did not know who sent it, he knew it could only be Nina taking a risk to protect him. And that made him realize just how dangerous this was for her. And for a second, he wondered if he should stop and walk away to keep her safe. But then he looked around the diner once more, at the tired faces of the workers, at the cheap food on the plates, at the memory of his father slowly fading from the walls, and he knew he could not leave again. And so when the diner finally closed and the last customers walked out, Marcus stayed hidden in his car across the street, watching the back door carefully. And after a while, he saw Carl step out carrying heavy bags, placing them in the back of his vehicle. And Marcus quietly got out and moved closer, his heart beating hard in his chest. And from behind a large trash bin, he lifted his phone and began to record. And he watched as Carl opened one of the bags, showing spoiled meat and expired boxes that were meant to be thrown away, but instead were being hidden. And Marcus now had clear proof of the lies. And in that moment, he realized how deep the problem truly was. And as Carl slammed the trunk shut and rushed back inside, Marcus stepped back into the shadows, breathing slowly, knowing this was only the beginning, and that the next move he made could either save the diner or destroy everything, including the quiet, fragile bond that had begun to grow between him and Nina. The next day felt heavier than all the others, as if the air itself knew something dangerous was coming. And Marcus could feel it in the slow way the clouds moved above the diner, and in the tight knot that refused to leave his chest. But he still pulled his cap low, put on the same worn jacket, and walked back inside, because he knew now that he could not stop halfway. And as soon as he entered, he felt it. The tension was thicker, sharper, and Carl's eyes lifted instantly toward him, narrow and watchful like he had been expecting him. And Marcus kept his face calm even though his heart began to beat faster. And he walked to a table and sat down without ordering anything, pretending to scroll on his phone. But in truth, his senses were wide open, listening, watching, waiting, because he knew Carl had begun to suspect something. And then he noticed a new worker behind the counter, a nervous young man he had never seen before. And this worker kept glancing toward Marcus, his eyes full of fear and uncertainty. as if he was carrying a secret he did not want to carry. And Marcus slowly started to realize that someone must have seen him the night before near the back of the diner. Someone who had told Carl, and the thought made his jaw tighten. Because betrayal always hurt more when it came from fear instead of hate. And while Marcus sat there, Nina walked out of the kitchen carrying a tray. But the moment she saw Carl watching her, she quickly looked away, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. And Marcus could tell something had already happened, something that had shaken her. And he wanted to go to her to ask if she was all right. But he knew any open concern would only make things worse for her. And then Carl stepped forward, his heavy footsteps echoing through the quiet room. And he called out in a fake friendly voice, "Nina, my office." Now. And the room seemed to stop breathing as everyone watched her slowly place the tray down and walk toward him, her hands trembling slightly. And Marcus's fingers curled against his palm as he watched her disappear into the small office near the kitchen, the door shutting behind her with a sharp click. And the silence that followed felt like a storm trapped inside four walls. And Marcus imagined Carl sitting across from her, his voice low and poisonous, his words filled with threats. And he wondered if she would be strong enough to hold on. Because he knew Carl used fear like a weapon, and after what felt like forever, Nina walked back out, her eyes red, her face carefully blank. And she did not look at Marcus even once. But when she passed his table, a small, folded paper slipped from her hand to the floor near his feet. And no one noticed except him, and he bent down slowly as if tying his shoe, picking it up in a single quick movement and hiding it in his pocket. And he could feel the weight of it like a stone, heavy with whatever truth waited inside. And when his fingers finally opened it a moment later beneath the table, he read the words that made his whole body turn cold. Because scrawled across the paper were the words, "He knows who you are. He wants to trap you tonight. If I don't help him, I lose my job and maybe worse." And Marcus stared at the message again and again, feeling a mix of anger, fear, and a strange pain for Nina's suffering. And he slowly raised his eyes to meet hers from across the room. And for a brief second she looked back, and in that single look he saw everything. Her fear, her strength, and her silent apology. And he shook his head very slightly, a promise without words that he did not blame her. And then he knew the truth. Carl was no longer just afraid of losing control. He was ready to hurt someone to keep it, and as the day moved slowly toward night, Marcus knew that a trap was waiting for him. And even though every part of him warned him to run, another stronger part, the part built by his father's lessons and his own broken loyalty, told him that sometimes to save something, a man had to walk straight into the danger that was meant to destroy him. Marcus stood in the middle of the diner, frozen for a moment, as every pair of eyes locked onto him. The room full of fear and shock after Mrs. Adams collapsed and the poison had been revealed. The sirens of an ambulance could be heard far away in the distance, getting closer with every second. Nina was still holding the small bottle she had pulled from Mrs. Adams' purse, her hands shaking as if the weight of the truth in that bottle was too heavy to carry. Marcus slowly moved toward her, keeping his voice calm even though his heart was racing faster than it ever had in his life, and said, "You were right to warn me." The words seemed simple, but they held the weight of everything that had happened. Nina looked up at him with wide eyes, surprised not by what he said, but by the kindness in his tone, as if he had forgiven her for keeping so many secrets from him. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "I had no choice. She told me if I said anything to you, she would destroy me and my family. She said no one would ever believe a poor waitress over the rich owner of this place." Marcus clenched his fists because he knew she was right in a sad way. Mrs. Adams had created a world where fear ruled, where people were too scared to speak, and where truth had been buried under lies for far too long. Outside, people had already gathered, whispering and pointing through the glass windows, trying to understand what was happening in their favorite diner. Inside, the customers remained frozen, not daring to move, not daring to speak, as if the wrong word might bring another danger. Marcus lifted his hand slightly to show he meant no harm and spoke louder now so everyone could hear him. "My name is Marcus Taylor. This is my father's diner. I am the real owner." A deep silence fell over the room. Some gasped. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others stared at him as if he was a ghost that had suddenly returned. 2 years ago, this place was taken from me through lies and false papers. I left because I thought I had lost everything. But today, I came back not as the owner, not as a rich man, but as a customer. And I found the truth hiding behind a simple piece of toast. Nina looked at him, shocked. You are Marcus?" she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. He nodded slowly. "Yes, and you are the only reason I am still standing here." Tears rolled down her face as the reality of it hit her. All this time, the man she had tried to protect had been the very person this diner once belonged to, the man whose photo had been removed, the man whose story had been erased. The sound of the ambulance finally stopped outside, and 2 medics rushed in, moving straight toward Mrs. Adams, who was now barely conscious, muttering broken words as they lifted her onto a stretcher. One of them asked, "What did she take?" Marcus pointed to the bottle in Nina's hand. "That. She planned for someone else to take it, but fate chose her instead." As the medics carried Mrs. Adams away, police officers entered behind them. One of them stepped forward and asked what had happened. Marcus did not hesitate. He told them everything. About the changed papers, the missing photo, the strange behavior in the diner, and the warning whisper. Customers backed up his story. Some admitted they had felt sick after eating there before. Others said they had seen Mrs. Adams arguing with Nina at night. Each word added another stone to the wall of truth that Mrs. Adams could no longer break down. The officers nodded, writing everything down, and one of them looked at Marcus carefully and said, "If what you say is true, this place will be returned to you. But there is more to uncover. We need your cooperation." Marcus agreed, because this was no longer just about him. It was about everyone she had hurt and controlled. The police then turned to Nina, asking her if she was willing to give a full statement. Her body shook as fear returned to her, but Marcus placed a gentle hand on the counter in front of her, not touching her, but offering silent support. "You are safe now," he said. "She has no power here anymore." Nina took a deep breath and began to speak. She told him about the threats, the late-night meetings, the whispered orders, and how Mrs. Adams had once laughed and said, "If Marcus Taylor ever walks in here again, I will make sure he never walks out." Hearing those words made a chill run across the room, but it also made something else rise. Hope. Because the truth was finally free. Outside, the sky was turning a soft orange as the sun began to lower, shining through the diner windows in a warm, golden light. Marcus looked around the diner again, but this time it felt different. It no longer felt like a place where his past had been erased. It felt like a place that was still waiting for him, holding on to the memory of his father, his dreams, and the life he had almost lost. He walked behind the counter slowly, running his fingers along the edge where his father used to stand and make jokes with customers. A small, sad smile touched his lips. "I'm back, Dad," he murmured under his breath. "And this time, I'm not leaving." Nina stood nearby, watching him in silence. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. Marcus turned to her, and for the first time, he smiled at her fully, not as a broken man, but as someone who had found his purpose again. "First, I make this place safe. Then, I make it better than it ever was. And I want you to stay, not as a scared waitress, but as part of a new beginning." Her eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. The customers, who had listened to every word, slowly began to clap. One clap became two, then many, filling the diner with a sound that had been missing for years: hope. But just as the moment reached its brightest point, a police officer walked in again, holding a small, brown envelope he had found hidden in Mrs. Adams' office. "Marcus," he said seriously, "you need to see this." Marcus opened the envelope with careful fingers, and inside were photographs of him from the last 2 days. Walking, watching, waiting. Someone had been following him long before he stepped into the diner. Someone else knew he had returned. Marcus looked up slowly, his face turning serious again. The danger was not over yet. Marcus held the photographs in his hands as if they might burn him, his eyes moving from one image to the next, each one showing him from behind, from the side, from across the street. Proof that someone had been watching his every move long before he stepped back into Sunset Bites. And a deep silence filled the diner, because everyone understood at the same moment that Mrs. Adams was not the only enemy, that there was another shadow still moving somewhere outside those walls. And Nina looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to burst through the door any second, while the police officer, who had found the envelope, said in a low voice that this was not normal, that this meant planning, timing, and intention. And Marcus felt a strange calm wash over him, because now that he knew the danger was real, he was no longer walking in the dark, and he lifted his head and said quietly, "Bring me to her office," and the officer nodded. They walked together to the small back room where Mrs. Adams had once ruled like a queen, and the air inside felt thick and cold. The desk messy with papers, fake contracts, and accounts that showed money being moved to strange places. And Marcus began to look through everything slowly, not with anger, but with sharp focus, because he wanted answers. And then, under a stack of papers, he found another envelope, older, yellowed at the edges, and written on the front were the words, "For Marcus Taylor, when he returns." His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, and inside was a letter. The handwriting was familiar. His heart dropped. It was his uncle's writing. The same uncle who had smiled at him as a child. The same uncle who had vanished around the time Marcus lost the diner. The same uncle he had believed had moved far away for a new life. But now the truth was staring directly at him from the page. "Dear Marcus," it said, "if you are reading this, then you have finally come back to where you belong. I watched over this place after your father passed, but I realized something. I deserved it more than you ever did. It was supposed to be mine. And since I could not run the diner myself without showing my face, I found someone who could. Mrs. Adams did only what she was told to do. She was a piece, nothing more. I was the hand moving the board. I wanted you to feel small, lost. I wanted you to leave so I could control everything from the shadows. And even now, if you think this is over, you are wrong. I'm much closer than you think." Marcus stopped reading. The air left his lungs. Every sound around him faded. Then, slowly, a memory came rushing back to him. The night 2 days ago, when he had walked past a man standing across the street, a man wearing a hat pulled down low. A man who had felt familiar even without seeing his face. He walked to the window of the office and looked outside at the street. And there he was, standing by the old lamppost. His uncle, watching him, smiling. Marcus stepped out of the office, walking back into the diner as the door slowly opened. And Marcus's uncle walked in as if he owned the place, his hands in his coat pockets, his eyes full of pride and cold satisfaction. And the customers froze again while Nina let out a silent gasp. "You've grown up, Marcus," his uncle said calmly. "And you came exactly like I knew you would. Curiosity always was your weakness." Marcus stepped forward, standing tall now, not as a lost man, not as a scared owner, but as someone who had nothing left to fear. "You took everything from me," he said. "You tried to erase my life." His uncle tilted his head slightly. "No, I just redirected it. You were never meant to be here. This dream belonged to me first." The police moved closer, ready to step in, but Marcus lifted a hand, stopping them. He looked his uncle straight in the eyes. "Then why all the poison? Why the threats? Why the fear?" he asked. A slow, ugly smile crossed his uncle's face. "Because a scared man is easier to control than a brave one." At that moment, Nina stepped forward, surprising everyone. Her voice was no longer shaking. "You lost," she said firmly. "Your plans are finished. The police have the papers. The threats are recorded. The truth is out." For a moment, his uncle's expression changed. Just a second of fear flashed in his eyes. Then, the police moved in and grabbed him, placing handcuffs around his wrists as he began to shout, claiming it was all lies, that Marcus had planned everything. But his voice grew smaller with every word as they led him out of the diner. And for the first time in years, there was no shadow left inside Sunset Bites. The danger was truly over. The following weeks were full of change. The diner was legally returned to Marcus. The walls were repainted in warm colors. His father's picture was placed back in its rightful place behind the counter. New menus were written. Fresh staff were hired. People came back, not just for the food, but for the story of the lost owner who had returned and taken back his life. The diner was filled with laughter again, with music again, with light again. And Nina stayed, not because she had to, but because Marcus asked her to help run the place with him. She was no longer just a waitress. She became the heart of the diner, greeting customers, making them feel safe, making them feel at home. One evening, as the sun set through the same windows where Marcus had once sat alone with poisoned toast in front of him, he stood beside Nina behind the counter and said softly, "You saved my life that day." She smiled, almost shy. "You came back to your life," she replied. "I just helped the door open." Outside, a new sign had been hung. Sunset Bites, family, truth. And fresh beginnings. Marcus looked around at the full diner, the happy faces, the warm light, and finally felt something he had not felt in years: peace.